I never thought a random rainstorm could change anything, let alone my whole day. But there I was, drenched and swearing under my breath, trying to find a dry spot anywhere near downtown without looking like a complete mess. That's when I noticed the small storefront, a dusty little bookstore that seemed to have been forgotten by time, and, apparently, by the rain clouds too. I darted inside just as the sky opened up like someone was dumping buckets from above. The bell above the door jingled softly, and the smell of old paper and coffee hit me like a warm blanket. I wasn't alone. Sitting on a worn-out armchair by the window was a guy maybe a few years older than me, with this easy half-smile that made it clear he wasn't just hiding from the rain. He looked like he belonged there. His dark hair was slicked back, and he had these glasses that gave him a kind of mysterious vibe, like he read too much poetry, or had a favorite obscure band no one else knew about. He glanced up when I came in, and for a second, I felt caught, like I was intruding on something private. But then he nodded towards the chair opposite him, and I dropped my soaked jacket on the floor without hesitation. It was the kind of space where people didn't just pass through. It felt like a little refuge, a secret spot in the middle of a city that was usually too loud and too fast. I wasn't really in the mood for chatting, honestly. The day had been one awkward thing after another. Work stress, a missed call I didn't want to answer, and now this. But there was something about him that made me want to stay put. Maybe just to see what this unexpected pause in the storm might bring. As the rain hammered harder against the windows, he spoke first, his voice low and easy. "Looks like we're stuck here for a while. I'm Nate." I said my name, feeling an odd kind of calm settle in. Something about sharing the silence, the storm, and that tiny bookstore felt like the start of something I hadn't been expecting, but was curious to explore. Just as I was about to ask him what brought him here today, the power flickered and went out, and the room plunged into a soft, cozy darkness. That's when I realized this wasn't just about waiting for the rain to stop anymore. In the soft darkness, the bookstore suddenly felt even more like a world apart from the busy city outside. Nate reached into his pocket and pulled out a small flashlight from his set of keys, flicking it on briefly to check the door and the window before turning it off again. The beam caught my eye for a moment, and I noticed a flicker of something, like he was used to dealing with moments like this, with unexpected silences and pauses. "So, blackout during a storm, classic," he said with a half laugh, settling back into his chair. "You don't usually get that sort of thing around here. Power's been pretty reliable." I nodded, tugging my jacket tighter around me. "Yeah, I guess I'm just unlucky today. Or maybe the weather's rubbing off on my luck." He smiled, and it wasn't one of those forced smiles people do to be polite. It felt genuine, like he actually wanted to understand what I was saying, even if I wasn't sure why I was sharing it. "Bad days have a way of turning into something better, you know," he said, a little softer this time. I looked at him, surprised by how easy it was to hear that and not feel like I had to explain or defend myself. It was like the rain outside had washed away some of the usual noise in my head. The store was quiet except for the rain tapping against the glass, and I found myself scanning the shelves. The place was a mix of old classics, some local history books, and a few random art zines scattered on a table near the counter. I noticed a small stack of postcards next to a vintage typewriter that looked like it hadn't been used in decades. "Do you work here?" I asked, nodding towards the counter. "Used to," Nate said, his eyes flicking to the typewriter. "I was actually the manager for a bit, but I'm more of a writer these days. Came back here last week to do some editing and catch a break from the city noise. Guess the storm had other plans." I raised an eyebrow. "A writer, huh? What do you write about?" "Mostly stories about people who get stuck," he said, grinning. "In a storm, in a moment, in life. I guess I'm fascinated by what happens when everything else pauses." That hit me harder than I expected. I'd spent a lot of time feeling stuck lately, like I was waiting for something to change but didn't know what or how. Somehow, hearing that from Nate made it feel less like a curse and more like part of the process. For a while, we just sat there, the rain keeping time with our quiet thoughts. Then, from somewhere beneath the counter, Nate pulled out a small box of matches and struck one against the rough edge. A candle flickered to life, casting soft, dancing shadows across the walls lined with books. "Ambiance upgrade," he joked, holding it out so I could see. The warm light made his eyes catch the glow in a way that made me think he wasn't just playing around. I laughed. honestly surprised that something as simple as a candle could shift the mood. It felt intimate, like the storm outside was less of a threat and more like an invitation to slow down and listen. "Want to see something weird?" Nate asked, his voice dropping into that playful tone again. I nodded, curious. He stood up and walked to the back of the store, moving with a kind of confident ease that made me wonder how long he'd been here. A moment later, he came back holding an old book. Its cover was worn, the title faded away, but the spine had a strange, almost eerie symbol stamped on it. "This is the weirdest book in the store," he said, flipping through the pages. "Local legend says it belonged to some eccentric who claimed it could predict storms. Or maybe just their mood swings. Either way, it's got some wild stories." I leaned in to get a better look, and as he read a passage aloud, I realized it wasn't so much about the storms outside, but about the storms people carry inside themselves. Things they don't say, moments they bury or run from. When he closed the book, there was a pause. The rain had slowed enough that it was just a steady patter on the roof instead of a roar. "So what about you?" Nate asked, sitting back down. "Why were you out in this mess today?" I hesitated, partly because I wasn't used to opening up to strangers, and partly because I wasn't sure how honest I wanted to be yet. But there was something about the way he asked that felt safe, like maybe he wasn't just making conversation. "Honestly, I was trying to clear my head," I said finally. "Work's been a nightmare, and I thought a walk might help. Instead, I just got caught in this storm and ended up here." He nodded, like he understood more than I was saying. "Sometimes the head needs storms too, to shake things up." I laughed softly. I never thought I'd say that about a storm, but yeah, maybe. For the first time all day, I felt like I wasn't alone in the middle of the chaos. Maybe it was the candlelight, the rain, or just the unexpected kindness in this stranger's eyes, but something about that moment made me want to stick around a little longer. Then, just as I was about to ask what he did when the power was out for hours, his phone buzzed. Soft, urgent, and totally out of place in the quiet room. He checked it quickly, then looked up at me with a sheepish grin. "Looks like the storm's not done with us yet. Want to grab a coffee? There's a place just down the street that's still open." I looked out the window where the sky was beginning to clear, the rain easing into a drizzle. For the first time since the day started, I felt a spark of something new. Curiosity, maybe even hope. "Yeah," I said, standing up and grabbing my jacket. "I think I'd like that." We stepped out into the damp street, the drizzle barely a whisper now, and the city smelled like wet pavement mixed with something faintly sweet, maybe the bakery down the block that never seemed to close early. Nate pulled his jacket tighter around himself, and I noticed how the light from the street lamps caught his profile, making his features look even softer. "I'm glad you said yes," he said, as we started walking toward the coffee shop. I was about to suggest waiting here until the power came back, but honestly, I'd rather be somewhere with caffeine and normal lighting. I laughed, the sound a little more genuine than I expected. "That sounds like a plan." I was about to melt into a puddle anyway. We fell into an easy rhythm as we walked, the kind of casual banter that felt like something I hadn't realized I missed. I told him about the disaster of my morning, how I'd spilled coffee on my shirt before the big meeting, how my phone had died right when I needed it most, and how I just wanted to escape everything for a bit. Nate listened, really listened, without interrupting or trying to fix things. When it was his turn, he shared stories of his own, how writing sometimes felt like yelling into the void, how he'd moved to the city to chase a dream that still felt just out of reach, and how quiet moments like this were rare and precious. We reached the coffee shop. It was small, with mismatched chairs and a chalkboard menu scrawled in colorful chalk. Inside, the warmth hit me like a hug, and the smell of brewing coffee wrapped around us instantly. Nate ordered a black coffee while I went for a latte, and we found a corner table by the window where the rain had finally stopped. Sitting across from each other, the world outside seemed to shrink down to just this little bubble, where time slowed and the noise faded away. Nate's eyes caught mine over the rim of his cup, and there was a softness there that made my chest tighten. "So," he said, stirring his coffee, "what's your story? Like really? Not the 'I had a bad day' kind, but the one you don't tell everyone." I hesitated, the question catching me off guard. It was weird how quickly we'd gone from strangers sheltering from a storm to this, sharing things I usually keep locked away. But looking at him, I felt a strange trust growing. Maybe it was the way his gaze wasn't searching for answers, just holding space. So I started talking, the stuff I usually shoved to the back of my mind. How I'd been out to myself for a while but still felt like I was hiding in plain sight. How dating had been awkward, disappointing, and sometimes just plain exhausting. How I wasn't sure if I was ready to put myself out there. Nate nodded, never judging, just listening. When I finished, he smiled gently. I get it. It's scary putting yourself out there, especially when you're not sure if the world's ready for the real you. I shrugged, but he could see through it. Yeah, it is. Maybe, he said, leaning forward slightly. It's not about the world being ready. Maybe it's about finding the right person to be ready for you. His words hit me in a way I didn't expect. It wasn't some cheesy pickup line or a quick fix. It was honest, and it felt like permission to hope. We talked for hours, or maybe just minutes. Time felt weird in that little coffee shop, about everything and nothing, about favorite books, terrible movies we secretly loved, music that shaped us, and the weird little things that made us who we are. At some point, the conversation slowed, and we just sat there, the silence between us feeling comfortable, not awkward. I realized I hadn't felt this scene in a long time, maybe ever. Do you want to get out of here? Nate asked quietly. Go for a walk? The storm's passed, but the city still got that fresh, washed-clean vibe. I nodded before I could overthink it. Yeah, I'd like that. Outside, the air was cool and smelled like promise. We wandered through streets still glistening with rain, the city lights reflecting in puddles like tiny stars scattered across the pavement. At one point, Nate stopped and pointed to a small mural painted on the side of a building, a splash of color in an otherwise gray alley. It was chaotic and beautiful, like someone had thrown paint at a wall and caught magic in the mess. Kinda like life, huh? He said. I smiled, feeling warmth spread through me that had nothing to do with the jacket I was wearing. Yeah, like life. As we walked, the conversation dipped into quieter moments again, this time filled with glances that lingered a little longer and smiles that reached deeper than words could explain. When we reached a small park bench under an old oak tree, Nate sat down and patted the space next to him. I hesitated only a second before joining him, the night wrapping us in a shared quiet. I know this is sudden, he said softly, but I'm really glad the storm brought us here. You feel like something I didn't know I was looking for. I looked at him, the way the streetlight hit his face, the way his eyes searched mine with a kind of hope that made me want to believe it too. Me too, I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. The city hummed around us, but for once, it felt like the whole world had narrowed down to just this moment, just this connection. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough to start something new. We sat there on that bench for a while, the night quiet except for distant city sounds, car tires on wet pavement, a dog barking somewhere far off. I was watching Nate's face in the dim light, trying to figure out how to say what was suddenly swirling inside me without sounding like a total fool. Because, honestly, this whole thing felt like a dream. The kind that's just vivid enough to feel real, but fragile enough to shatter with the tiniest wrong word. He cleared his throat softly. You know, I don't usually do this kind of thing. Talk to strangers like we've known each other forever. Yeah, me neither, I said, surprised at the ease in my voice. But sometimes the storm's gotta bring people together, I guess. He laughed, a quiet, warm sound that felt like it could chase away any leftover doubts. Exactly. Maybe storms are just life's way of making us slow down and notice the things we usually miss. For a second, I caught myself staring at his lips, wondering what it would be like to close the distance between us. But I didn't move. I didn't want to rush it or ruin the moment. Instead, I said, so what now? Do we pretend this never happened when the sun comes up? Nate's smile softened into something sincere. I don't want to pretend at all. If you're up for it, I'd like to see where this goes. No big expectations, no pressure, just whatever feels right. That line hit me harder than I expected. No pressure, no expectations, something I hadn't felt in a long time. I nodded, feeling a pulse of hope that maybe, just maybe, this could be the start of something real. We stood up from the bench, and the night air was cool but no longer biting. Nate slipped his hand into mine, a small gesture, but it made the world feel a little steadier. I squeezed back, and that simple connection sent a jolt straight to my chest. We wandered back toward the main street, not speaking much, but comfortable in the silence. When we passed a late-night taco truck, Nate looked over with that playful smirk he'd worn earlier. "Hungry?" he asked. "Always hungry," I said, laughing. We grabbed tacos and sat on the curb, eating and trading stories about the weirdest food we'd ever dared to try. Turns out, Nate was a sushi fan, but he had a hilarious story about the time he accidentally ordered octopus tentacles, thinking it was calamari. As the night deepened, the city slowly emptied out, but neither of us wanted to call it quits. There was an energy between us, like we'd stumbled on a thread and didn't want to let go. At some point, Nate asked if I wanted to come back to his place, not for anything heavy, just to keep talking, maybe watch a dumb movie or listen to music. My heart thudded a bit, but I surprised myself by saying yes. His apartment was a few blocks away, a cozy space filled with books, art prints, and a record player that looked well-loved. He put on a playlist, indie rock mixed with some older classics, and we sank into the couch like we'd done this 100 times before. The conversation flowed easily, but there were moments when the music filled the gaps, when I caught him looking at me with a quiet intensity that made me want to close the distance, but also made me nervous as hell. After a while, I found myself opening up more than I expected, talking about my family, the struggles with coming out, the fear of being vulnerable. Nate listened without interruption, his hand finding mine and holding it gently. "You're not alone," he said softly. "And you don't have to be afraid here." Those words wrapped around me like a shield. I swallowed the lump in my throat and leaned in just a little, feeling the warmth of his hand and the steady beat of his heart. Our lips met, tentative at first, testing the waters. Then deeper, like we'd been waiting for this moment all along. The night seemed to stretch, the quiet hum of the city outside fading into insignificance. When we finally pulled apart, Nate rested his forehead against mine, breath mingling with mine. "I don't want this night to end." "Me neither," I admitted. We stayed like that for a while before the reality of the late hour nudged us back. Nate offered to walk me home, and I gladly accepted, not wanting the night to end just yet. On the way, the city was almost empty, streetlights casting long shadows. We talked about plans, dreams, the kind of future that felt less scary when you imagined sharing it with someone. When we reached my building, I hesitated before stepping inside. Nate caught my hand, his eyes searching mine. "Can I see you again?" he asked, voice low. I smiled, feeling a rush of something I hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. "I'd like that." He leaned in for one last kiss. Soft, promising, full of everything words couldn't say. As I watched him walk away, the storm from earlier felt like a distant memory. What mattered was the unexpected calm, the spark, and the chance to say yes to something new. And for once, that felt like enough. The next morning, I woke up with the faint smell of rain lingering in the air and a surprisingly light heart. I'd expected to feel a mix of awkwardness and second-guessing, but all that was crowded out by a quiet excitement that settled in my chest. Nate's words and that kiss had already started rewriting something inside me, something I hadn't realized was stuck. I checked my phone. No text yet, which was honestly a relief. I didn't want to risk overthinking or putting pressure on what felt like the start of something fragile and new. Instead, I made some coffee, sat by the window, and let my mind wander back to last night. Then, just as I was about to scroll through some emails, my phone buzzed with a message. It was from Nate, *, "Good morning. Just wanted to say I had a great time last night. Hope your day's off to a better start than yesterday's storm." I smiled, fingers hovering over the keyboard, then typed back, *. "Me too. Definitely better. Coffee soon? *. The reply came quickly. *. "Absolutely. How about this afternoon? There's a little cafe I found that makes a mean espresso." *. That was the easy part. What came next was the slow build of anticipation, wondering what today would bring. The storm had passed, but something else was brewing, and it wasn't just the weather. When I met Nate that afternoon, the city was washed clean and bright, the kind of day that makes you forget the chaos from just a day before. We hugged hello, that brief touch sending a familiar spark through me. We grabbed coffee and wandered toward a nearby park, the kind with tall trees and winding paths that made you momentarily forget you were still in the middle of the city. We found a bench near a small pond where ducks floated lazily and sat side by side. I realized how comfortable I was with him, like a quiet understanding had grown overnight. We talked about everything from favorite childhood memories to what we feared most in the world. It wasn't just surface stuff. It was the kind of conversation that makes you feel seen. At one point, Nate turned toward me with a funny, nervous grin. "Can I ask you something a little weird?" "Sure," I said, curious. "Do you believe in signs? Like the universe nudging you toward something?" I thought about it for a second. I guess I didn't before, but after the way we met yesterday, maybe I'm starting to. He laughed softly. "Yeah, me too." There was a pause, just the sound of leaves rustling in the breeze. Then Nate reached for my hand again, and this time I didn't hesitate. The days that followed weren't perfect. There were moments of awkwardness, of trying to figure out where this fit into our lives. But there was also laughter, shared dinners in tiny apartments with music too loud, and quiet nights talking about dreams that previously felt too big to say out loud. One evening, after a long day at work, I found myself at Nate's place again. We'd been texting all day, sending each other little jokes and inside references that made me grin like a kid. When I came in, Nate was sitting on the couch, a blanket wrapped around his shoulders and a book in hand. "Hey," he said, looking up with that same warm smile. "Hey," I replied, kicking off my shoes and collapsing next to him. We didn't say much at first, just letting the comfort of the moment fill the room. Then, Nate put down the book and looked at me with a seriousness that made my heart skip. "I know it's still early," he said, "but I want you to know that whatever happens, I'm here. No rush, no pressure, just here." I swallowed the lump in my throat and nodded. "Same here. I'm glad I met you." He reached out, brushing a stray strand of hair from my forehead, and that simple touch said everything words couldn't. Over the next few weeks, things deepened in ways I hadn't dared hope for. We became each other's quiet place in the noise, the solace in a city that often felt too big and too lonely. I started telling friends about Nate, and while some reactions were mixed, it felt good to finally say his name out loud with a smile. One night, we went back to the bookstore where it all started. The owner had returned the power by then, and the place smelled the same, of rain on paper and a hint of coffee. We wandered the aisles, fingers brushing over spines, and sharing favorite titles. In a quiet corner, Nate pulled out that weird old book about storms. "Remember this?" he said, eyes twinkling. "Of course," I laughed. "The book that made us realize every storm has its own story." He nodded. "And maybe ours is just beginning." We stood there, surrounded by stories of old, feeling like we were writing one of our own. And for once, the storm wasn't something to fear, but a reminder that sometimes the unexpected can lead you exactly where you're meant to be. That night at the bookstore felt like a quiet turning point. We stood there amidst the racks and stacks, Nate's fingers tracing the faded cover of that old storm book, and I could feel something unspoken stretching between us, something gentle but real, like the calm after a long rain. As we walked out into the cool night air, I realized how much I'd come to look forward to these moments with him. The easy silences, the conversations that didn't need to be forced, and the way just being near him made the noise in my head quiet down. Over the next few days, we fell into a rhythm that felt natural, like a song you didn't have to think about to sing. Nate was the kind of person who noticed the small things, the way I always sipped my coffee too fast, or how I'd hum a tune when I was lost in thought. And I found myself wanting to share more. A new poem I'd been working on, the terrible but hilarious movie I binge-watched, even my weird obsession with collecting old postcards. One lazy Sunday, we ended up sprawled out on Nate's couch, surrounded by half-read books and empty coffee mugs. The city outside was gray and overcast, but inside it felt like time had slowed to a crawl. I was watching him as he flipped through a vinyl record, the soft crackle of the needle hitting the grooves filling the room. "Want to dance?" he asked suddenly, holding up the record. I laughed. "In here?" I think I'd probably knock over that lamp. He grinned. I meant slow dance. No space needed. I hesitated, then nodded, setting my coffee down. Nate reached out and took my hand, pulling me close. There was no music except that quiet crackle and the rain beginning softly against the windows. But it didn't matter. We moved together awkwardly at first, then with a kind of ease that surprised me. His arms felt like home, steady and warm. I looked up to find his eyes searching mine, and there was a vulnerability there that made me want to be brave too. "I'm glad we found each other," he murmured. "Me too," I said, my voice barely a whisper. The next few weeks weren't without their bumps. There were moments when old fears bubbled up, nights when I wondered if I was moving too fast, or if Nate was really as into this as I was. Sometimes, I'd catch him staring off into space, and I'd worry that maybe he was carrying his own worries that he wasn't ready to share. One evening, after a long day at work, I found Nate sitting on the floor of his apartment, surrounded by scattered pages and notebooks. His usual easy smile was missing, replaced by a tension I hadn't seen before. "What's going on?" I asked, sitting beside him. He sighed and ran a hand through his hair. "I'm stuck. This story I've been working on, it feels like it's unraveling, and I don't know how to fix it." I reached out and squeezed his hand. "Want me to read it?" Sometimes a fresh pair of eyes helps. He looked up, a flicker of hope in his eyes. "Would you?" So I did. We spent that night going over his work, talking through ideas and plotting twists, and by the end, I could see the light returning to his face. It struck me then how much we were becoming a part of each other's lives, not just in the easy moments, but in the messy ones too. One afternoon, we took a walk along the river, the air crisp with the coming of fall. Leaves crunched underfoot, and the sun cast a golden glow over everything. Nate stopped and pulled me close, his eyes serious. "I've been thinking," he said, "about us, about what this could be." My heart started racing. "Yeah?" He nodded. "I want to be more than just this, whatever it is so far. I want you to know I'm serious." I smiled, feeling a warmth spread through me that wasn't just from the sun. "I'm serious too. I want to see where this goes." We leaned into each other then, that quiet promise hanging between us like a fragile thread we were both willing to hold on to. Life didn't suddenly get perfect. There were still tough days, misunderstandings, and moments of doubt. But with Nate, everything felt more bearable, like we were building something real out of the chaos. One night, we found ourselves back at that little coffee shop where we'd spent hours on our first day after the storm. The barista recognized us and smiled knowingly as she brought over 2 cups. We sat across from each other, tracing the rim of our mugs with tired fingers. Nate reached across the table and took my hand, his eyes warm and steady. "No matter what storms come," he said quietly, "I want to face them with you." I squeezed his hand back, feeling the weight of those words settle deep inside me. "Me too," I whispered. And in that moment, surrounded by the hum of the city and the scent of coffee, I knew this was just the beginning of our story, storm and all. Months had passed since that first stormy day, and the city had settled into its usual rhythm, the noise, But in the middle of it all, Nate and I had found our own steady corner, a quiet space that felt like home. We kept coming back to that little bookstore, the coffee shop, the park bench by the pond, places that had somehow stitched themselves into the fabric of us. They weren't just spots on a map anymore. They were markers of where we'd grown, where we'd chosen to be vulnerable and brave. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in soft shades of pink and orange, Nate and I walked along the riverside. The air was crisp, the kind that tells you fall is just around the corner. We slowed to a stop near a bench, the one with the best view of the water reflecting the fading light. Without thinking, I reached for his hand. His fingers curled around mine like they always did. Easy, familiar, a quiet reassurance. We sat, watching the city lights blink on one by one across the skyline. "It's wild to think about all this," I said, nodding toward the world around us. "How a chance storm led me to you." Nate smiled, his eyes soft and full of something I'd come to recognize as home. Sometimes the most unexpected moments turn out to be the ones that matter the most. I looked at him then, really looked, and I saw all the little things, the kindness, the patience, the way he made me feel seen, without asking for anything more than I could give. "I'm glad we took a chance," I said, voice low but steady. He leaned over, resting his forehead against mine. "Me too." In that quiet moment, the rush of life slowed down enough for me to realize something important. Love wasn't always fireworks or grand declarations. Sometimes it was finding someone who makes the ordinary feel a little brighter, who holds your hand when the storms come, and who chooses to stay. We stayed there on the bench, watching the city breathe beneath the twilight, knowing that whatever came next, we had this calm after the storm, this steady light. And for the first time in a long time, I felt exactly where I was meant to be.